Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a certified instructor for SANS, teaching the Cyber Threat Intelligence course, also Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. And I'm so excited to dive in this month to a topic near and dear to my heart, of intelligence requirements. So today we are fortunate to be joined by Jamie Collier and Shanyn Ronis of Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud. I have to make sure to say that. I can't always remember. But Jamie, Shanyn, thanks so much for coming and joining today. I would love to start by just having you give the audience a sense of your background, who you are, what you do.
Sure thing. Well, thanks for having us on, Katie. I'm Jamie Collier. I'm a senior threat intelligence advisor at Mandiant, so based within London, and spend my time with our organizations based in EMEA. So really helping them understand, what are the threats we're seeing in EMEA, what can they do about them?
And hi, folks. My name is Shanyn Ronis. I am based in Virginia, and I lead a function called the Mandiant Communication Center. We're essentially kind of the translation layer between the intelligence analysis team and the rest of the company. And we're going to talk a lot about key stakeholders and analysis and how all of these things should impact Intel requirements today. So really, really happy to be here.
Awesome. I had the pleasure of seeing Jamie and Shanyn speak over at a cyber threat conference from SANS in London. And they were awesome presenters. So very excited to have them talk through this blog / it's not really a blog, it's a report. Like, it is a very detailed, in-depth report. We'll drop the link in for you so you can check it out as we're talking through this. So the title is A Requirements-Driven Approach to Cyber Threat Intelligence. So maybe a good place to start is, what's a requirement? Because I know this is something we throw around a lot. How do you all think of that term requirement?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and probably something we'll dig into throughout, because I think what we've actually done is we've tried to separate stakeholder analysis and intelligence requirements. An intelligence requirement is something that, yes, it includes the understanding of stakeholders and their needs, but also, for instance, incorporating the threat profile, that understanding of the threats out there. So it's quite a few different things that are folding into intelligence requirements. But yeah, not sure if Shannon's got anything else to add there.
Yeah, I think for me, the easiest way to think about requirements is that they direct all of the activity across all the different steps across the intelligence lifecycle that your organization should be focusing on. So I think a major challenge that a lot of organizations run into is just, there's so many intelligence reports, there's so much happening in the news, there's so many potential threats out there, that what do you focus on, and how do you make sure you maintain the focus on the things that are the most important? We work with a lot of organizations who really, they're very focused on, hey, what do I see on my network right now? That's what I want to focus on, because it's obviously a threat to me. What we see, we have evidence of it being on the network. And when folks are having their requirements derived out of the things that they can see, in other words, if they're only focusing on the things that they can see, a lot of times they end up doing things like chasing coin miners when they could have APT on their network, because they don't know to look for those things because they're so bogged down playing whack-a-mole. So the requirements are really designed to help folks focus on the things that matter most and that can have the biggest detrimental impact to the organization.
That's a great way to frame it. What matters most, because there are so many things happening and potential threats. And I know that my team, we have shiny object syndrome, and you're like, oh, they're talking about the Fortinet vulnerability. Now it's the MoveIt vulnerability, and you might be missing something. So I always think of requirements as like questions or pain points, or like things that you could try to help answer with cyber threat intelligence. So just kind of baselining there. So this is an awesome paper, 22 pages, talking about not just what a requirement is, but this overall approach. And I'm curious, why did you all think this was an important paper to write on your team? These things do not happen overnight. What was your motivation behind writing this?
I think it was actually really, really simple. I mean, the approach itself is really simple, right? It's pretty simple. It's a commitment across that intelligence lifecycle to really put stakeholder needs at the heart of the intelligence we produce. But when we look at it, this focus on intelligence requirements is just the best investment you can make as a threat intel function, right? It's so simple, but it's often not practiced in reality. But if we get the requirements right, if we document them, if we capture them, and then we actually stick to them, well, that's going to provide tremendous focus, as Shannon highlighted. it's going to make sure that the intelligence we produce is actually really tied very directly to improving security outcomes. So we're not just talking about threats for the sake of them, but really tied to actually moving the dial for different parts of the security function. And it also helps us really listen. I think we forget, right? We're also passionate about the threat landscape, about doing Russia-Ukraine deep dives, etc. We almost kind of, a lot of threat intelligence work is kind of about talking or writing reports. But actually what intelligence requirements do is it takes it back to listening to those stakeholders, making sure we understand their concerns and reacting to those. So what we wanted to do was kind of look at the reality out there, which is that a lot of organizations either don't know where to get started with a threat intel function. And we talk a lot about, life cycles, about different structured analytical techniques. Where do we actually go on kind of day one if we're going to build this out from scratch? Or we see organizations aren't necessarily, conducting this sort of approach in practice. So we wanted to provide some kind of really kind of practical advice. And you'll see the paper's got things like templates. It's got a lot of kind of how-to emphasis that really made it easy to organizations, to intelligence functions, to really be able to kind of carry this out and kind of realize all those benefits.
Yeah, a lot of what you said, sorry, Shannon, really resonates with me. Like the challenge sometimes as threat analysts, intel analysts, even SOC analysts, we always focus on the things we're excited about. And you said we have to listen to others, right? What are other people concerned about? Yeah, Shannon, you were chiming in as well.
Yeah, I think it's really common for organizations who are maybe just getting started with threat intel to say, all right, now we just got to make sure that this one person who's in the SOC is going to be dual-hatted. Now they're our threat intel person and they're our SOC analyst. And let's just make sure they have access to all the right threat feeds, right? Let's make sure they have access to all the tools that they need to be able to get value out of that. And essentially without requirements, all you've done is taken all these different pieces of news, and instead of having your entire team look at them and try to figure out what to do with them, you're now feeding them in through one person who is saying, I don't know what to do with any of this. Should I read all of these? What's the so what? What's the implication? Which ones do we care about most? Which ones do we care about first? Which ones should be actioned first and by whom? There's a whole bunch of sort of metadata almost, or context around these different requirements that really have to be built in for organizations to not only know which pieces of information or which pieces of intelligence are relevant and useful, but also useful to whom, useful in what way. So if I'm going to run with this piece of intel, how should I run with it? Should I get ready to present it to more of a strategic audience, or do I need to get this to the SOC right away because we really care about this? There's just a lot of understanding sort of where internal processes meet external intelligence that helps sort of different intel analysts turn that intelligence into action. And requirements really should be the engine behind that. They should kind of outline the breadth of here's what we want to focus on, here's how we want to focus on it, here's how quickly we want to focus on it, and here's what we're going to do with this. And if you don't have those things built in, and if you don't have them at a glance that's very easily accessible and everybody's agreed on them, then you're going to get a lot of folks who are trying to reinvent the wheel constantly. And that's even less time to dedicate to the absolutely vast amount of intel that is out there. So that's why I'm most excited about jumping onto this paper, is to help folks figure out and get over that sort of initial information overload paralysis. And even if they get past that to figure out what's interesting, then the action overload paralysis. So
I like your description of the requirements as an engine, right? Like fueling it. And I think this is something that maybe we overlook. And I love what you said about how like having a process for this and having a plan, how are we going to approach this? It actually increases the time that we can do the work because we already know, what's the approach we're going to be taking. So I appreciate that. Well, I'm just scrolling down to kind of the introduction. So I like a good diagram. Would this be a good place to kind of talk through what's the overall workflow here? Like what are the inputs and outputs people should think about if they want to follow this process, this approach?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think I've got to put my hands up at the front end and say I'm a little bit of a skeptic at times of the intelligence lifecycle. So probably going to have a lot of booing in the comments right now because I know a lot of folks really kind of live by that. But I think the point is, look, the intelligence lifecycle is a great kind of high level overview of the process around threat intelligence. But we often don't really kind of dive in and think, how do we kind of go into this in more detail? So what we try to do with this, with our kind of cycle or our kind of diagram in that initial figure was think, if we're just going to say requirements is kind of part of that life cycle, how do we dig into that? How do we actually put a bit of meat on those bones? And we kind of divide this up in different ways, but we start off with these kind of two different components. It's number one, stakeholder analysis. So that's getting to know the people we're going to be working with in our security function or outside of our security function, of course. That's our SOC analyst, it's our CISO, it's our risk manager, it's all of those people, understanding not just what they do, but what are their challenges. And when we understand the challenges in their job, maybe we can then dig into where does threat intelligence play a role in making those challenges easier. And then on the other hand, you've got the threat profile. So this is looking at the threats that matter to my organization. This is typically based on threats that we see active in a sector, a region, an industry, etc. And from there, we can kind of really start digging into not only intelligence requirements, so I think we kind of already covered that, but also use cases. So that really starts to document the challenges, as I mentioned, and then how threat intelligence can really start to address some of those challenges. I think one thing that we've also focused on here is service lines. That is the idea that actually a lot of the different intelligence requirements we have might have similarities, right? We might actually have multiple different intelligence requirements or multiple stakeholders that have intelligence requirements and requests that have something to do with tracking attacker techniques that matter to us. So with service lines, we can actually start to create efficiencies in the way we deliver and produce threat intelligence. And of course, that leads to the kind of outputs, as we all know, in terms of the production, the dissemination of threat intelligence. And then one thing that we've dug into detail, perhaps we could talk a little bit more about later, is stakeholder feedback, right? That is something that is really important to take seriously. I think it's sometimes a bit of the kind of Oliver Twist of the intelligence lifecycle. It's the bit we get the report out and then we forget how do we kind of get that really good feedback. It becomes the kind of the neglected kind of orphan, if you like, of the lifecycle. So we wanted to really center in on that. Shanyn, was there anything I missed from your perspective?
No, I think I always like to drive home the stakeholder analysis portion of this, because I think a lot of organizations might really understand that they need to have requirements, but stakeholder analysis might be a brand new concept. And you really can't do this well if you don't understand the recipients of whatever intelligence it is that you're producing or localizing to them. I think this concept of intelligence has to lead to action. And I say this every chance that I possibly get in every single webinar, but intelligence having to lead to action. It's not the Intel analyst who is responsible for creating that action. It is a stakeholder who receives the intelligence report. So if you don't understand that stakeholder, if you don't understand how they like to consume information, if you're going to stage the intelligence you're providing on a platform that they never use, or you're providing strategic level intelligence to a tactical person who's like, I don't know what to do with a strategic level country profile. I need IOCs. I need indicators that I can go search for. If you don't understand those use cases and the decisions that they're trying to make and the problems they're trying to solve, then the requirements you're going to be filling are not going to fulfill the need that they have, and they're not going to lead to action. And so in a lot of cases, you run the risk of just doing intelligence for the sake of doing intelligence, which is what we absolutely want to move away from. We want to create action. We want to have impact. We want to reduce risk. So again, starting with stakeholders for me is always the most important thing. And this is really challenging to do, because a lot of folks say, hey, I'm going to go talk to all my different stakeholders. I'm going to do interviews. I'm going to put out a questionnaire and say, hey, how can Intel help you? And a lot of times stakeholders are going to come back and say, I have no idea what it is that you do. I do not understand what intelligence is. I do not understand what it can do for me. Maybe, can you please help me? So a big part of that stakeholder analysis is education as much as it is getting educated about your stakeholders. It is having those conversations. It's coming at it from an angle in a lot of times. So not asking, hey, what can intelligence do for you? But hey, what is the thing that keeps you up at night with your job? What is the thing that worries you the most? Where do you run into the most problems? What are the things that you wish you knew more about, or you had better visibility into things that you're really uncertain about, whether they're internal to the organization or part of the threat landscape? So being able to have these really well-rounded, not straight line discovery conversations is incredibly important to being able to then work backwards to extract requirements from there. Because otherwise, again, you're really just going to miss exactly what they need.
Yeah,
I think
diving into this section, I think there's some solid advice here. Like one of the things you said, Shanyn, like this is sort of maybe, I guess it's not unique to Intel, but oftentimes we have to educate people about what we do, right? So like, what can intelligence do for you, Shannon? If you ask that of your stakeholders, they're gonna be like, I don't know. So I like the suggestion, like examples, or like, hey, would this be useful to you? Or what you said about like what keeps you up at night. Or I've found if it's possible for your intel analysts to sit with whomever your stakeholders are, like for us, detection engineers, right? Or like SOC analysts, if you can sit with them and just like observe their challenges, that's another way I've found to try to break down those barriers. Yeah, Jamie, you were going to chime in as well.
Yeah, I think one reflection for me is just how ambiguous threat intelligence can be, right? I think everyone knows what incident response is. You know, we've got something bad in our network. We need someone to help us get it out. But I would have thought if you go to a security team that's not using threat intelligence, or you go to a security conference and you ask people to write down, you know, what does threat intelligence look like? You know, you're going to have some people there that just think it's an indicator feed. You're going to maybe be having other communities that have kind of been tracking what we've, you know, the kind of direction of travel we've gone with MITRE ATT&CK and attack techniques. You'll get other people that are deeply skeptical, right? They'll say that actually this is just fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's kind of marketing propaganda in disguise. You'll get other people that see this as a strategic influencer at board level, you know, in terms of providing that kind of macro perspective on the threats. So there's, I think to Shannon's point, there's just so much level setting that we need to do here, not only to kind of guide organizations and stakeholders through those different definitions and kind of help them understand it's quite a flexible offering, but also to, you know, I think as threat intelligence professionals, we need to appreciate that people might have had negative experiences with threat intelligence in the past, or they might see it in a different way. They might have been in an organization that had a very operational view on threat intelligence, a very kind of indicator junkie led approach, if you like. And actually, maybe we look at it in a very different way, in a much more strategic way. So it's definitely a kind of two-way street when it comes to education, for sure.
I'll use an example. So early on in my career, one of my very first jobs was as a fusion analyst. So that's meant to be the bridge between the SOC operators and intel, right? Because a lot of times, in a lot of cases, and this is very common in this field, it's almost like folks are speaking different languages, right? Because the operators are so focused on what they see on the network in a lot of cases. And there's this perception of folks who are in, and I've heard it called like a fuzzy intel bubble, who only care about APT actors, who are looking on stuff that has nothing to do with our network. And so my very first day on the job, I was sitting down with the intel team to learn the requirements. And the head of the SOC came in and interrupted the conversation and said, no. I don't want you talking to them. I want you focusing on what we can see in front of us on the network, because we know that it's there. And the response was, okay, fine, but how confident are you in your visibility? Because I've never met an organization that has 100% visibility over everything. So what are you not seeing that should be keeping you up at night is another way I think of kind of combating that bias that a lot of folks seem to have against intel. Kind of thinking things through about how do we get proactive? How do we make sure we're finding things before they're visible on the network and blocking them before they become a problem?
Absolutely. So in this kind of stakeholder section, one of the things you mentioned is defining use cases. So I like this table up here. Let me find it on different use case examples, right? I think it's helpful as you talk about in the stakeholder section, like, hey, sometimes people need examples. So like, I think this could be a really useful thing to take and go to your incident response team and be like, hey, could we help you? Or if you have these teams in your environment, right, going to them and kind of clues for the stakeholder analysis. So I'm curious if there are any other, advice you have on this use case piece of the process and, why that's important.
I think Shannon's the big use case expert here, so I definitely kind of defer to her, and I think especially around kind of how we kind of capture that. I know Shannon's done a lot of thinking around that.
Yeah, I think use cases are interesting because, like so many things in this field, words mean different things to different people, or people have approximate understandings of a concept. So for me, when I think about use cases, I really just think about different ways of using intel to gain value, right? Across different teams. How are the different teams using it to get value? I think the most important thing when building out these use cases, and this can be an entire dedicated work stream all on its own that should be constantly updated as you're talking to your different stakeholders. I think the most important thing is to understand all of the supporting processes behind these use cases and all of the things about, I guess, the intention would be to move away from an if you build it, they will come kind of mentality, right? We don't just want to sort of plot out intel tied to this single decision. We don't want to, if the use case is, hey, folks need to tighten up their decision cycle in response to high priority cyber crises, we want to then look at all of the supporting infrastructure beneath that individual use case. Otherwise, we're gonna miss it again, right? So, like, again, who specifically is engaged in this use case? How do we best get in touch with them? What's the SLA when it comes to reaching out with this? Time matters in everything, right? So is this a stop everything, pick up the phone in the middle of the night kind of deal? Or is this more of a, hey, we can wait until next week? Having all of these things appended to the individual use case, as well as the requirement that is the engine for identifying the intel related to that use case, is going to make it possible to, hey, and my analyst spent 2 weeks pulling together intel on the specific topic, when in reality, we should have gotten this out the door 2 weeks ago. It was an emergency, limited information would have been fine, right? That was the use case. That was the impact that they needed to have. We've missed it because we didn't have all of that information, that supporting sort of requirements and infrastructure mapped out well.
I think maybe one thing to add as well is that this, I think out of all of the steps, this is the one that's got to be deeply pragmatic and really focused on ground truth. And I think sometimes when we give advice about kind of how to a threat intelligence, we have a very kind of ideal state in mind. You know, it's an organization with a lot of resources, et cetera. And that's just not the reality for a lot of organizations. A lot of teams right now are pretty tired, are pretty burned out. And, you know, I kind of go back to what our vulnerability manager or intelligence manager always talks about, which kind of talks about how, you know, around 10 years ago, people were asking, you know, what should I patch first? And now the conversation is almost like, what can I get away without patching? Because we just have all of these vulnerabilities and we can't effectively kind of triage and prioritize them. So I think this is the part where it's really important to have those honest conversations and create an atmosphere where we can be honest about, you know, what's actually going on under the hood. Because often the realities of network defense aren't quite as cushy or aren't quite as glamorous as we might kind of make out. So this is the bit where we really want to understand that ground truth, really want to understand the lived experience of the stakeholders that we're working with, because from there, then we can start to really build out you know, really precise intelligence requirements that are going to directly address challenges around prioritization, maybe issues around burnout, alert fatigue, all of these different things. The more honest we can be here, you know, the better the intelligence requirements are going to be.
So that's probably a good segue into the requirements section. So we talked a little bit about stakeholders, we kind of defined requirements, and right, by talking to those stakeholders, that's how you can get your requirements, right? So, you know, I think to your point, Jamie, time is a piece of that, like setting the expectation for, okay, we're going to communicate this within X period of time. And I really like what you say here about measuring, right? Meeting the requirements. So kind of scrolling through, this helped me kind of visualize this a little bit. I'm curious your thoughts on, you know, how should people record these requirements and then in a way that can help you measure success as well, like you recommend?
Sure thing. Well, I could maybe give some kind of high level overviews. Shannon's done a lot on the organizing of the requirements, but I think on actually kind of capturing them, there's a few kind of principles really important to stress. I think first of all, this should be something that's achievable. They should be precise. As you mentioned, Katie, should have very explicit ratings. So I think there's some kind of things that we want to make clear at the front end, right? And if we think about an organization that's a bit worried about their exposure following kind of Russia-Ukraine conflict, you know, having a requirement that's cyber threats around Russia is not particularly a great requirement. You know, we might want to have a requirement around Russian cyber threats that have been active in the last 6 months that are could impact our sector. You know, then we can start to kind of get that in place. And I think maybe the last thing, just on the kind of high level reflections, is we've talked a lot so far about the listening piece, the working with the stakeholders, and that is absolutely the focus, and that's where we want to be spending the majority of our time. But I do think it's also important that we start to, when we talk about intelligence requirements, it's not just the stakeholder analysis, it is that threat profile. So what I mean by that is starting to blend in the kind of understanding that we have as a threat intelligence team on the threats that really matter, right? Because we might be getting some questions that are about threats that maybe don't matter so much. So that's where we, as much as we're listening, we're also as experts kind of coming in and making sure we kind of account for the threats that really matter. But Shanyn, you might have kind of some thoughts. I know you've done a lot on and you were the kind of main author on that kind of organizing intelligence requirements.
That was absolutely a team effort. I will do my best to represent everything the team put together. If you don't mind scrolling back down to that template.
Yeah.
So I think, as is the answer and really everything related to threat intelligence, is that the answer depends on a lot of different factors and a lot of different contexts. I think there's a couple of different ways to think through how to organize the intel requirements. One way to do it is to kind of get together your sort of council of Elrond, who's looked at all of the different sort of intel products that have been produced over the last couple of years, or whatever time frame you think is most relevant, and kind of start to say, what patterns do we see emerging? What do we see in terms of the topics that folks are interested in, the things that we've gotten by request, the things that we've proactively pushed, map to any sort of feedback if we've gotten any feedback. A lot of times that's not actually feasible or possible for a lot of different reasons. Looking at things like when we get these requests, what's the typical priority tied to them, right? Is it, hey, we get this request shot off the hip from an executive, we need to get it turned around in 6 hours. Just kind of getting the full landscape of past of what we've gotten from a requirements perspective. Then kind of looking as well at any sort of cases that have come out of the SOC. What have we seen in terms of, as Jamie was kind of talking about, threat landscape? What have we actually seen in terms of threat activity that's come after us? And then looking at the threat profile based on our industry, based on our geography, based on our vertical, all of those things. Who do we expect to be targeting us, and how might they come after us, right? And then once you're able to sort of build out the priorities of what you need to sort of build your requirements around, right? Which of all of the things that we've kind of enumerated as potential threats based on what we've written on the past, the cases we've seen in the past, which ones from a risk perspective do we need to worry about the most, right? It's going to help you really figure out that priority sort of tagging. And again, if there's any sort of specific things that come from your leadership that says this definitely has to be a priority if it comes from such and such person, building all of that stuff in as well. And then using that priority sort of row as different tags, right? I think the other thing that you can do is then look at different tagged categories. What are we looking at more? Are we getting more of an impact when we put out content related to adversary TTPs? Are our teams able to do more things with those types of products? Do we get more inbound requests tied to threat actor tracking and the products that we put out? Are those resulting in more impact? The other way that you can sort of tag the categories is based on staffing, right? How is your team built out? Do you have different teams that focus on different geographies or different technologies? Do you want to use the tagging as a mechanism for workflow management as well? Or do you want to use a separate tagging system for that and then have those category tags be a little bit more granular? A lot of it is going to depend on, do you have any OKRs built out? So if you have reporting and success metrics at the end of all of these cycles, if they're cycles, so they don't technically have an end, but you know what I'm saying? At the end of the year or whenever you do sort of OKR management, how robust are those? If they're robust, how do you make sure that the tags and the different sort of things that you're tracking for individual requirements align to those OKRs? Because that's going to help you very tactically collect the right information, so you don't have to then do a deep dive at the end of the year when you're trying to report on those OKRs. You just go back and you sort of do metrics on the tags you've already built in. A lot of
OKRs being objectives and key results. We
Yes.
use that acronym, but just in case. So overall goals, right? Talking about aligning the requirements and maybe the intelligence outputs to overall organization goals, right? That's sort of the idea there.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, these are the engine to making sure that what you're doing is in alignment with those goals. So, and ideally it would almost be like a waterfall or a cascade where there should not necessarily be an intel requirement that is outside of or arbitrary to those larger goals or the larger threats that you're tracking, right? If you've got something that is an intel requirement or is being nominated as a requirement that just kind of seems out of left field, or doesn't align with those other sort of anything that you're seeing in your threat profile or anything that you've prioritized in the past, that's really an opportunity to interrogate that requirement itself. But if it is a valid requirement, then to interrogate, well, how did we build out our threat profile in the first place? Why did we not capture this? What were we missing when we were conceptualizing our attack surface or the threats that we care about? And how can we now learn from this in order to make sure that we're not potentially missing this in the future.
So
I think maybe one thing to add as well
Go ahead.
is when we get into this, right, and a lot of people, myself included, aren't the biggest fan, don't spend too much time on Excel and those sorts of platforms. I think, oh no, am I going to have to start documenting everything? I'm really busy. I've got a load of requests for intelligence that are due. I don't want to be spending my time doing this. And I think what I would say is that for organizations and for intelligence teams that are maybe struggling to keep on top of everything, they shouldn't document everything despite that busy workload, but precisely because of it. And what I mean by that is if we are struggling to balance competing demands, if we're being asked all of these different intelligence requests from all of these different stakeholders, actually spending a few days getting this kind of documentation right gives us a really meaningful way to triage those requests going forward. So we can actually say, sorry, we're too busy. This is a low intelligence requirement priority. This is going to, we're not going to be able to fulfill this right now because there's kind of a lot going on with Move It, and we've had to kind of address some other kind of high priority intelligence requirements. So really, actually, what this does is it allows us to build a much more kind of sustainable workflow in the way that we do intelligence. And as I said, that's something that was really important to us, that we really spoke to that kind of lived experience of a threat intelligence team that's maybe got those limited resources, struggling to keep up. This is exactly what they need to get that balance and give them that kind of clear space as well.
And then,
Jamie, I think that's a great point, and that's definitely the experience I've had. That it takes some time to do this kind of tracking, but I've found that if you aren't formally doing this tracking, someone's trying to do it in their head, and chances are that that's much more frustrating for the team or the manager or whoever the individual is, trying to mentally keep track of like, oh, we were supposed to write this thing on Seaborgium or whatever, and then Move It came in, and then wait, which one's a higher priority? So hand wavy very quickly. So I think, a little time to organize, as we've said earlier, I think actually saves you time in the end.
And I think kind of dovetailing on that as well is that from a management and a resourcing perspective, being able to, at the end of the year, sort of look back and take stock and say, all right, we've got 30 standing requirements. When I look at the Intel products that we created, we really only addressed 15 of them. We had a gap when it came to this 15. Well, why? Did we not have enough resources? Was there not related threat activity? What story can this tell us about our existing requirements? Do we maybe need to readdress them? Do we need to revisit them? Do we need to update them? Do we need to staff up over here? Or do we need to maybe staff down over here because this no longer seems relevant? We're not producing any intel and we're fine for not having done that. I think it really, having that plan and then being able to look back at the year and say, how well did we operate in a way that was in accordance with plan? And if we didn't, why not? Where were the roadblocks? Because now when we're planning for next year, we have a whole lot of data points that we can use to make sure we're going to staff up and optimize in the right way.
One thing you'd mentioned that I wanted to dive into a little bit, because I know this is a challenge for many people, is that threat profile piece. And I'm curious, I didn't find a section in skimming, but right, it says threat profile. I would call this sort of threat modeling, though that's a term that people hand wave, right? Identifies the threats that are likely to target an organization. I'm curious if you have any guidance on how should people approach that? Because even if maybe you're not a formal CTI team, I think that's definitely a component that any cybersecurity team wants. How do we do threat profiling?
Well, I think first of all, I'd say watch this space, because we should have more resources coming out specifically on this in the future. But I think effectively what we're doing with a threat profile at a very high level is looking at the intersection of two things. So on the one hand, you've got that external threat landscape. What's happening to organizations that look like me? What are the threats that I see active in my region, in my sector, in my industry? We might not want to just look at sector and region specific threats, given how many threats are region sector agnostic. If we look at kind of many globally active threats right now, threats that are kind of active across the world, but we want to look at generally, what's happening to organizations that look like me, combining those sector region specific views as well as kind of globally active trends that are likely to impact our organization. So that's kind of part one of a threat profile. We kind of think of it like a Venn diagram. And then the other part of the Venn diagram that we're interested in is what our internal organization looks like. What's our network stack? What sort of systems are we running? what sort of data are we holding, and what we want to look at is where those two things come together. So where are the threats that we're concerned about impact the kind of organizational profile that we've got. So if we're running completely OS X, everyone's got a MacBook, maybe we don't need to be quite as concerned about some of the kind of Windows malware, et cetera, that's going about. So we're really interested in making sure that when we talk about the threat landscape, it's something that's going to be really relevant, not just from a kind of sector region perspective, but relevant to our own stack.
As you were talking, I was thinking, I wrote this blog post a while back, and it's an area where there's not really a whole lot of, I don't know, guidance on. So I am very excited to watch this space and see what else comes out from you all. But if this helps others, right, this process of thinking about like our organization, what we have, as you said, Jamie, and then like our adversaries and trying to align that. So I like the Venn diagram approach to threat profiling or threat modeling. I think we're talking about the same thing, prioritizing the threats.
For sure.
Nice. So more to come on threat profiling. I won't hold you to that, but I'm kind of excited. So let's dive in other pieces of this. So we talked a little bit about requirements. One question I forgot to ask, how would you track these requirements? Like you mentioned kind of tagging, that could get a little complex. Like, do you do this in a spreadsheet? Do you need like a ticket tool like Jira? How would you all recommend tracking this?
I've seen a lot of different ways. I think a lot of organizations start with Excel, and then a lot of times they try to move toward more sophisticated tools. And at the end of the day, they oftentimes end up coming back to Excel or Sheets, as the case may be. Just because a lot of the things you want to be able to filter, you want to be able to have tables nested inside of other tables. And you also want to be able to zoom out and have that at a glance, everything in one spot look. And so I think a lot of folks end up finding Excel is the right tool for that, but it's a lot of preference as well. I don't know, Jamie, if you've had different experiences.
I think the future's with Google Sheets, but that's all I've got to say about it.
Spreadsheets, they're at least the second best tool for any job. So I am a spreadsheet advocate as well. So diving in, we talked a little about requirements. I noticed this next section, key component of this, collection sources. So can you talk a little bit about, how would you route in like figuring out the collection sources as part of this overall process?
So one thing that we do, and in a lot of our training content, we put this out as well, is that we advise folks to maintain a sort of curated database of collection sources that they like to use. And then they sort of constantly, whether it's quarterly, whether it's annually is usually a little more realistic given bandwidth, but revisit that list and assess it for things like bias. Use Admiralty code to sort of look at the quality of the information that's being put out and the quality of the source itself, and then make sure that it's a wide, sort of very wide-ranging list that has a lot of different sort of frames of reference and a lot of different lenses, so you don't unintentionally introduce bias at the source level into whatever you're looking at, right? And then the other thing that we recommend is that when you are doing an Intel requirement, you list the sources right up front for a couple of different reasons. Number one, you want to make sure that if you have a requirement that's going to one analyst versus another, their sort of source preferences are not then going to introduce bias at that stage, right? You've got a whole list of 30 different sources, but that analyst really loves these 10, whereas that analyst loves those other 10, and there's a possibility that they're going to come up with different results if they work on this independently, right? So you want to make sure that those collection sources are valid, but that they're also wide-ranging enough where you can get sort of a very balanced look and a very complete look at a topic. And then when
the Wikipedia page on Admiralty, that is a hard word to say, Admiralty codes, because I think that's a really important concept. For example, on this live stream, we talk about open source reporting and like, random people on Twitter, and you're like, cool, but I don't really know, like, not usually reliable. So I like this, if you use this coding or not, considering how reliable are my different sources. I think that's a good thing to do. Neat.
And then the other things that and this is just an example, again, there's a million different ways under the sun to do these. We also put down the stakeholders, right? And the reason that we include the stakeholders up front is because, again, at a glance, you can get a good sense of, do I need to sit down as an analyst and write a 12-page report? Or if I see that my executive leadership is one of the stakeholders here, I can, based on the results of my stakeholder analysis, which I've hopefully done already, but also just come from context clues, I can assume that probably don't want to do a 12-page report for my executive leadership because they probably don't have time to read it. So what's a better way to do this, right? How do I make sure that the language and the tone and the level of detail and all of that maps very well to those stakeholders? And at the same time, if the organization has any sort of data sharing policies or data sharing restrictions. So if I looked at that list and I saw that there was, for example, a marketing team, I might include very different information than I would if it was to an internal only team, because I never want to provide information to somebody that they can't use. If you do that enough times, and over time, it's going to break trust. If I keep giving my marketing team things that I'm like, this is really interesting, but don't tell anybody about this, at a certain point, they're going to be so scared that they're going to get in trouble if they use anything that I send them, that they're going to stop reading what I'm sending them, right? So part of this is making sure that right there, built into the requirement, repetition, you're going to see it every time. What are the parameters? What are all the things you need to consider, from collection sources to stakeholders to intent to the product type, that's going to influence every stage of the product creation, whether it's scoping, whether it's actual composition, whether it's level of detail, whether it's the structure of the product, right? Do you know, does it need to be a PowerPoint presentation or a Google Slides presentation, or does it need to be a written document based on the stakeholder analysis, based on all the different pieces of context that I've already identified? How can that help me make the right decision for this specific requirement?
Absolutely. So scrolling through, we talked a little bit about Intel requirements, organizing them, but I wonder if you could kind of talk through this chart, because one thing I kind of like here is, okay, if you have like a specific number for your Intel requirement, and then you publish a monthly threat summary, you can specifically be like, it fulfills what you asked us for here, right? So I kind of like this organization.
And I think there's a lot of different ways to do the naming conventions tied to different requirements. But again, it all should come back to the OKRs and how you're trying to track these things, right? So here you kind of see in this one, you see, I think this one shows the year. It could show the specific product. It could show the team, the designated team that this comes out of. There we go. That has the analyst IDs as well. But maybe if you are a very large team, right, and you've sort of prioritized that this year we're going to focus on defending specific network segments, right? This year we've had some real issues with this segment over here and no issues over here, or issues with this technology type being targeted, but no issues with this technology type being targeted. Maybe your naming convention then should reflect that, right? It should have a code that talks about, at a glance, we've done X number of products reflected in Intel requirements that help protect this sector of the network. Again, that helps you at the end of the year go back and say, well, where did we have a gap? Or where did we maybe over focus because we were caught in a stance where we were responding to inbound requests, and the requests from the team responsible for that network were just very, very verbose, whereas this team over here maybe was a little bit quieter, right? So now we've got a bias introduced to the team in terms of how we are sort of what requests we're working on, right? So I think the naming convention for any requirement really, again, it depends. It's going to come back to that again and again. It's going to depend on what you're trying to measure and track. I like this one as well because if we broke it down to strategic, operational, and tactical, there's a lot of things that you can do with even just that basic knowledge. If I'm going to walk into a room and give a briefing, that's the first question I ask is, what level of intelligence am I providing? Is it strategic, operational, or tactical? Because those are very different things. Am I going to give, again, those like in-depth, down to very specific snippets of code tied to malware deployments? Probably not going to give that again to an executive officer. That's probably something I'm going to save for the SOC operators. Whereas if I'm going to look at that same topic from a strategic level, I'm going to be less interested in how the malware functions and more interested in its potential impact. The so what does this mean for the organization? What does this mean in terms of relative risk? Again, just really that basic knowledge. You can look at the same topic across those three different lenses and walk away with a very different story and a very different set of data points you're covering.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about in Forensics 578 is you can use the same information to produce intelligence at all those levels, right? If you're looking at intrusion and like diving into the malware and the TTPs, like that's one level, but then your executives might want to know about that intrusion as well. So kind of the same information to produce at those different levels. Well, scrolling through here, we haven't talked about feedback yet. Effective feedback in the diagram that we started with is part of this. Feedback is notoriously difficult. I think we had a comment very early on about what a challenge that is, especially in a fast-moving field. So what advice do you have on trying to get any kind of feedback back to the Intel team?
Well, I could maybe talk through some of the different points we've got. I think we put out 5 in the end. I think the first one is this idea of fostering a learning culture. So that really means a few different things. I think first of all, it means having a culture within your intelligence team that actually takes feedback really seriously, right? And I was certainly guilty of this in my analyst days, that I'd finish the report, it gets sent out to the stakeholder, and it was kind of felt like beer o'clock, right? It's kind of time to crack open a couple of cold ones, kind of enjoy my Friday afternoon. And actually, I should be just as interested, and feedback should really be part of that workflow. The job doesn't necessarily finish when the report is being put out. So that is part of it, is just an intelligence team seeing feedback and gathering feedback, capturing it, organizing it. That is part of the job. And if you're not doing that seriously, then it's worth thinking about that in more detail. The second part of that is to treat this as a learning experience, right? That if stakeholders don't like bits and pieces of a threat intelligence report, if they think it could be better, to actually thrive on that and see that as a learning experience, a way to, a kind of a ticket, if you like, to help us improve. And I say that because getting constructive feedback or negative criticism, however you want to spin it, can be a very deeply personal kind of experience, right? And it can make us all feel horrendous. I'm the sort of person, if I get 50 kind of positive feedbacks, but one negative bit of feedback, I'll be really kind of focused on the negative thing, and that will kind of take over. So we want to actually understand and kind of embrace, those opportunities to improve. On the flip side of that, we want to really celebrate and really understand the positives. So I'm not, not just saying that to make us all feel kind of warm and fuzzy in a threat intelligence function, although that's certainly great, and we want to document those successes. We want to understand where our intelligence really did help, parts of the security function. But there's also a very pragmatic case beyond just kind of morale for why we want to capture those positives in the feedback, is because actually that allows us to build more effective intelligence in the future. If we have an executive say, thanks for that intelligence report, it was really useful. I particularly found this part of the report useful, where you talked about, implications for our reputation. Then I know in the future, that's something I've got to be really focused on. That's something that's going to really help this executive. I can be much more proactive in the way that I write our, intelligence reports, if I know what a stakeholder is going to really kind of find useful. The third thing we discussed is this idea of feedback as a practice. So that is trying to incorporate some sort of routine, some sort of practice in how we capture feedback. Ideally, this isn't just a static kind of end of year review type thing. Mm-hmm. How can we actually incorporate this into a regular workflow? How can we make it as easy as possible to leave feedback? How do we lower the friction to leaving feedback, right? So is there a link on every threat intelligence report that makes it really easy to provide feedback? Do I know who to get in touch with when I need to leave feedback as a stakeholder? Is that an individual? Is it a shared mailbox that kind of outlasts any one individual staying in the company, etc.? So just thinking about how we lower the friction, how we make it seamless, how we kind of do that on a more regular basis, if possible. Number 4, we've already kind of discussed a little bit, but that is the idea that this isn't purely a passive exercise, right? It's not just that we're collecting feedback. We're often dealing with stakeholders that don't have much experience using threat intelligence. Often it's the threat intelligence team, the analysts, that are quite clearly the experts in threat intelligence. So we shouldn't be afraid to kind of push back or at least provide suggestions on how we think stakeholders could themselves improve in their consumption of threat intelligence, right? So that is something that it can kind of depend on the personalities, but we want to really take ownership on that, kind of educating stakeholders, helping them understand, look, this is really one of the clear opportunities to benefit from threat intelligence. And there's always a bit of a balancing act there. There's a balance between listening and reacting and kind of providing suggestion, but we want to have both of those. And then I think finally, it's just that idea of human in the loop, right? It's actually, let's build these human relationships. Not everything around feedback has to be a kind of dry email. Maybe we could actually meet some of these stakeholders now that we don't have, as kind of serious a pandemic concern, maybe we could actually have a coffee with someone, get to know them, build those relationships. That makes it much, much easier to make these suggestions, to have these kind of honest conversations. Things are less likely to be misinterpreted as well. So building those positive relationships. I always think a big test of a threat intelligence team is how well integrated it is in that broader security function. Is an internal intelligence team kind of just doing drinks amongst themselves, or are they kind of well-known, kind of socialized amongst that security function, interacting with those folks on a regular basis? I think that's something that we kind of don't really talk about that much. But it's really important that threat intelligence teams aren't siloed, and they should be really integrated into these different use cases and requirements.
Yeah, comment coming in online that a lot of technical experts are resistant to feedback or advice from people who don't share their technical expertise, right? Kind of what you said, Jamie, like, I don't know, I personally get defensive, but I think that's a great point from the audience on, just because someone maybe isn't as technical or maybe not a malware analyst, they can still comment on the output, right? They're still a stakeholder, a consumer. So feedback, accepting it is always tough. I think building that into the culture is great advice.
The one kind of thing that I would add to that, other than sort of double tapping that humanizing the Intel team is incredibly important, and integrating as much as you can, Jamie. I 1,000,000% agree with that. I think the other thing is to as early as you can, make an effort to win with a team. And by win, I mean deliver value to a team. Give them an Intel report and spend a lot of time, especially the first couple, 1 or 2 or 3 that you're putting out, to have a lot of back and forth with that, with the recipients of that, to set a precedent that this is a two-way road. I'm really curious in what you have to say. We are co-creators of this in a sense, in terms of production and sort of execution, right? We're doing these things together. But then, especially if you're able to draw that straight line between an Intel report and an impact that stakeholder that can then cause, now all of a sudden they know what success feels like. They know what success looks like. And by the inverse, they'll know when the Intel team has missed the mark. And that means that they're much more likely to be able to then proactively reach out, because you now establish that strong relationship and you've created a co-creating space. But now they're also able to very definitively say, this isn't quite up to the standard that we created together before. Let's kind of unpack together why we didn't quite get there. So even in the process of receiving the feedback, I would really encourage folks on the Intel teams to, and I want to say interrogate that feedback. I don't mean interrogate the people who provided the feedback in any sense of the word. I mean really take it, not just take it at face value, but really unpack that and reach out to that person in a very non-threatening but a very supportive way to unpack, well, what exactly did this mean? Because a lot of times, maybe it's represented in one way, but the core underlying issue really has nothing to do with that Intel product. It has to do with, you put it on a platform that nobody saw in time, right? So helping to use that as a starting place to diagnose what actually happened, I think, is really important.
I think that's good advice, not just for intelligence, but any kind of feedback. Like, let me not just take it at face value. Like, what are you actually saying behind that? And I think I'm glad you all added the human in the loop, because I've heard from a lot of CTI teams who have these surveys and they try to send out a form and they're like, no one responded. That's where I think maybe as a human being like, hey, can we have a quick chat about this? Was this useful? No, not to be overlooked as well. Awesome. Well, we're actually coming up towards time. So I'll encourage folks reading this section. I think we've kind of talked about why do this, right? It sounds like a lot of work, but just to reiterate, right, this improves outcomes. Make sure that you're not wasting your time, right, on something that isn't actually important to your stakeholders. So I'll just kind of highlight at the end, and what I really like is that there's templates, things to get you started. So right, overall kind of talking through this threat profiling and kind of feeding that down. And then I like templates, right? If you're interested in going out there and trying an intelligence requirement, right, here are the things to think about. Collection sources we talked about, who are your stakeholders, etc. So any last thoughts, Jamie, Shannon, or anything we didn't talk about in this wealth of knowledge that we should have?
I think maybe the last thought from me is that this is really easy, right? I think so often we overcomplicate things in threat intelligence. We go down rabbit holes. For any organizations that's not doing this and thinking, oh, maybe I should start documenting some of the things we've discussed. I think all I'd say is that anyone can do this, right? You don't need to be Mandiant, you don't need to be Red Canary, you don't need to be this, doing all the kind of SANS stuff where you're really kind of big and you kind of got that high maturity. Any CTI function can and should be requirements led, and just see it as something that's really easy, could kind of be done reasonably quickly, and is going to just provide dramatic benefits. But I think focusing on the fact that it's really achievable is really important.
It's a great point. Even if someone is, an army of one CTI analyst, or maybe you dual hat, you're a SOC analyst or an admin and you do CTI, still just starting with like, who are your stakeholders and making a requirements list. Yeah, I think it's a great point. Shanyn.
Yeah, I think kind of dovetailing on that again, I think going together, so don't try to create these in a silo. Don't try to do them on your own, because again, you're just going to give people what you think that they want. Just go have that conversation and work from what they actually want and help them get there. And don't overcommit yourself across too many different requirements. Start off with one or two, go slow, build. You're probably going to build so many that you do have a tipping point and say, wait a second, now I have too many. What do I do? Do I staff up? Do I now use this to demonstrate value to the business and say, if we don't staff up, here's all the requirements we cannot monitor? Or do you then sort of scale your requirements back down and kind of concentrate those? And updating. Jamie talked earlier about iterative cycles. Keep that cycle going, keep it open until requirements are never actually done. So just keep that in mind, build it into your workflow, build it into your resourcing, that whatever cadence is feasible, whether again, that's quarterly or at least annually, revisit those requirements and make any changes that you have to.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, and thanks to the whole team who created this report. If folks want to follow in case you release other awesome reports, your Twitter handles are on there. I'm sure you'll retweet any future reports. Awesome.
For sure. Thanks so much, Katie.
Thank you for having us.
Shanyn, thank you so much for joining. This is an awesome discussion. Just one quick reminder for anyone who's looking for threat content, we have the Ransomware Summit coming up this Friday, June 23rd, I believe that is. This is online, totally free. So we're not going to get to our threat content, but if you're tracking ransomware, definitely check out this summit, free registration this Friday. So with that, that's all we have for you. Again, thanks to Jamie and Shanyn, our guests, and thanks to you all for tuning in. We hope to see you on a future STAR live stream. Be well.